Merci bien, Jonathan. Bonjour à tous, and good morning to you all, or good day, depending on where you are. I'm on the West Coast. I'm sure a lot of people are on different parts of the world and the continent. So I really have the honor today of introducing Robert J. Shiller, this year's John Kuszczak Memorial Lecture presenter. I know that in this group, I don't really have to introduce Robert very much. He's well known among many of you, but nevertheless, let me kind of say a few things about him. Just reminding you, well, he is the Sterling Professor of Economics at Yale University, and he's also Professor of Finance at the Yale School of Management. Now, when we think about Bob, there's so many things he's worked on. You know, he's worked on financial markets, financial innovation, risk sharing, macroeconomics, real estate, and in particular for this conference on behavioral economics, and he's really been a leader in that aspect. La contribution de Robert à la science économique et à la finance a été reconnue vraiment aux plus hautes instances. En 2013, Robert a reçu le prix Nobel de la science économique. C'est particulièrement important pour nous de souligner que c'est seulement la deuxième fois que nous avons quelqu'un qui a reçu le prix Nobel de la science économique qui donne notre présentation John Kuszczak. Donc, on est très content de l'avoir avec nous. Now, Robert has kind of made so much to our understanding of economics. I have a bit of trouble of kind of knowing where to start. So I'm going to start where I learned some of his things first. So I was a graduate student at that time, and I really had the pleasure of having his student John Campbell as a professor. John was a assistant professor then, and he kind of taught some of Robert's work. Not surprisingly, he taught some of their joint work together at the same time. Now, at that point, I kind of going back to asset price kind of theory and some of the advances made there. And I think it kind of links into kind of further things Robert has done since then. So at the beginning, this was the aspect of really questioning our kind of standard present discounted value model. And we all know that model and we like it very well. You know, this idea that, you know, especially for stock prices, you think about them as kind of representing this discounted value of dividends. And what Robert's work has shown is that actually is not a model that kind of captures the data very well. Dividends are just not, you know, volatile enough to explain the kind of movements that we see in stock prices. And that really leads us to kind of re-question how we're modeling things like asset prices. And certainly that was the idea under rational expectations. It's not, so we can kind of question rational expectations. It might be the way we discount also that might matter, and that's another way of kind of trying to reconcile those things. So at that point, it was really bringing out the puzzle. Here's a kind of standard theory. It really doesn't fit very well. And I see a lot of the work that Robert has done since then has really been to kind of give us tools to actually try to answer it, kind of different aspects of behavioral tools that, you know, tell us, okay, then if we're going to move away from either rational expectations or even kind of how we discount and how people see risk, that we now need tools. So we went from a puzzle and over time gave us elements to how to think about things. And I think that's a really important pieces. Now, sometimes I think even some of those basic insights that Robert had early on in his career are not always taken into account and seriously enough in a lot of our macro modeling, and that includes at central banks. When I look at some of the models we use, some of the structural models we use, they also have implications for asset prices and stock prices in particular. And if we looked at those implications, we'd often find that they do a really poor job. Now, we usually put them aside, and one of the aspects might be like, oh, well, in the central bank, we're not so interested in the stock market. But I don't think that's the right way of thinking about it. If it's missing on that, there's something missing in the model, and that would be true also of house prices or different things. And so we have aspects that are in our models doesn't capture that variability in a lot of asset prices, and we need to kind of think about the elements we might, you know, need to bring in. And again, Robert's work in this type of area kind of gives us a lot of thinking and a lot of pieces of how to bring that in and what to do. Now, when I think of Robert's career, you know, he just has an amazing set of skills. You know, he's obviously a great empiricist. He's done theory, and he's also a very practical person. Now, some of you might know some of his work on macro markets, and if you don't, I really recommend that you go read these Clarendon lectures that kind of get at this aspect of thinking about some of the markets that might be missing in our world. And even if he's written that kind of a while back, some of these markets are still missing. This this is really the idea that, a lot of us are affected by things that are really out of our control, and we'd like to kind of find ways of hedging them. And the current markets we have are not kind of always there. And this is a really practical book that kind of says, how we should kind of develop and kind of increase those markets. And some of them, since his work, have appeared in kind of more prevalent. But actually, there's still be room to have more. And maybe over the next years or so, we'll see even more of that kind of emerge. I have to say one particular area that I've always liked of Robert's work is all his work on booms and busts and bubbles. That's something that's actually always been close to my own heart. Have to say he's among that kind of select few that were kind of managed to predict and kind of the burst of the dot-com bubble in the 90s, and also then foreshadow all those difficulties in the housing market in the 2000s, kind of noticing again off that idea that there might be problems in these markets. He gave us kind of, there's words like irrational exuberance, animal spirits. He gave us kind of content to kind of how to think about those type of words. Not surprisingly, those are kind of words that are title of some of his books. So he has books on each of those. And those are, again, things that kind of give us the elements and the tools to kind of develop and kind of bring a lot of the ideas of how to, help us advance and make models that are more relevant for us as in central banks. Now that brings me to Bob's most recent book, which is published in 2019. And this is a book on narrative economics. Now, I'm not going to say too much because I know this is part of the lecture today is going to be kind of touching on that. But I really do want to say a few things. I really do think it is a book that's to my taste, really important. It's really multidisciplinary at its heart. It really takes everything of social sciences on all aspects and tries to bring it in. It really has the human at the core. And this is kind of like understanding we're a social science fundamentally, and we have to understand the limits and those the possibilities that the social sciences give us, and bring it in, and understanding that we're a social animal and we interact. And that's very much the kind of idea in narrative economics. It's really telling us that there's really a tremendous kind of gain of following and kind of understanding the stories that people tell each other, and how those both affect individuals directly and affect the collectivity. And it's not surprising, especially in this world, we're interconnected in a very different way with obviously social media, different things. You really, that possibility of having stories and narratives that are kind of moving around in the internet in particular, really allow for this kind of rich dynamics and that type of narrative to develop. And it might be that those narratives are wrong, but that doesn't matter. If they're playing this big role, if they're getting a lot of people on board, they can really matter. So we should be following them. And I think that brings us back also as central bankers. A lot of central bankers, and including at the Banque of Canada, we now do a lot of effort to kind of go out and do surveys and kind of discuss with people, kind of our BOSS survey in particular. So this is our business outlook survey, where we go and discuss with a whole bunch of business people trying to figure out how they're thinking. Now, what this is telling us is even when we think they might be getting it wrong in some sense, that's not the issue. It's really the issue of understanding how people are seeing things and to what extent we can use that. Donc, de ce côté-là, du point de vue d'une banque centrale, l'idée de promouvoir l'importance de la narration en économie est vraiment pertinente. C'est vraiment avec la possibilité de suivre des histoires et d'essayer de comprendre qu'est-ce qui se passe, qu'est-ce que les gens croient, on va être capable de mieux prévoir où est-ce qu'on va dans le futur. Donc, c'est vraiment à la base des éléments qu'il faut poursuivre, nous aussi, à la Banque centrale. Now, despite the importance of this idea of narratives, it's really still quite a bit at the beginning in our profession. So it's really an exciting area. And with this, I'm going to pass it over to Robert to give us this lecture today. And again, I thank you very much, Robert, for accepting this, and I really look forward to your talk.
Okay, thanks, Paul. Yes, I think that in some sense what I'm doing here today is, and in my book, Narrative Economics, is right, as a research proposal. And I don't see my slides.
If there's a problem, we can get Andy to put up your slides if it's not working.
Do you see them now?
Something's coming up. Yes.
All right. we're at a point in history where there's more data on individuals. I'm talking about digitized text, and or even getting into neuroeconomics, brain observations. These changes in available data, I think, will lead to a revolution analogous to that of the Keynesian revolution that came in with data on unemployment and stock market indexes that started to get attention, etc. We have a much richer data set now. And I think that one thing that we'll be able to explore is what are the stories that people are thinking about, and how do they change through time? I'm reminded that George Katona wrote a book in 1975 called Psychological Economics. And one of his observations was when he did in-person interviews asking for people's expectations, he came away thinking, you know, they don't have expectations. I had a sense that they were constructing them for me on the spot, but they didn't have expected anything in there. What they had is, well, then I'm adding to that, what they had is stories about inflation or whatever else. So I don't deny expectation survey. I'm doing it myself. But I think that we can augment that with a better idea of how people think the world works, economic world works, as exemplified by their stories. They don't write down equations. But they didn't understand the real interest rate. They still don't understand the real correcting interest rates for inflation. It wasn't until 1890s that the word even appeared for real interest rate. So what are they thinking? It's something about possible missed opportunity as illustrated by someone else's success, or a horror story about someone else's failure. Those things are important, as well as, I think it's still useful to ask about expectation, but they're not the whole picture as much as you think. So I'm going to talk here. I'm also going to say something about the individual markets. There is a state of apparent irrational exuberance, again, in financial markets, in many places, not everywhere. And why is it happening? Why is it happening right after the during the COVID-19 epidemic? It's a puzzle. And I think that part of the resolution of the puzzle, and I'm not going to really resolve it here, but it's to start thinking about the narratives that are behind this irrational exuberance. And I'm going to talk about models, but not economist model. I'm taking mathematical models from epidemiology and suggesting that they could be applied here. There is a strong parallel. My book came out in 2019, before COVID-19 was even a hint. But I think it was kind of coincidental. But thinking about ideas as epidemics is really important to understanding past episodes, financial or economic episodes. Going viral, as we call it nowadays. And I'm going to talk about some perennial narratives. One thing is that narratives can last for centuries, even millennia. Folklore studies, people tell us that Little Red Riding Hood can be found in a book written 1,000 years ago in Latin, believe it or not. It's not exactly the same story, but she was wearing a red coat, and she was a little girl threatened by a wolf. It seems like, yes, that story is 1,000 years old, and more than that. But then they come up in resurgences like epidemics of diseases do. They're never totally forgotten, or maybe there's some appeal to them, which is hard to pin down. So I'm going to talk about some perennial narratives that might be weakened today, but maybe they're coming back. We'll have to think about predicting that. It will help us in forecasting. And finally, I'm going to have some remarks, if I get to them, on how to do research more systematically. So I should put this on. So this is behavioral economics, but I find that it does combine with rational economics. Sometimes people are rational. I'll use an example of Deputy Governor Beaudry's work on implicit wages. I'm sorry, implicit contracts. What are implicit contracts? Well, it's in a case where some promises are implied. I think the contracts they're not written down, and they're not. It's something about honest or fair behavior, as illustrated by stories about good and bad people in the business world. Let me just talk first of all about the surprising levels of exuberance in markets today, which is I'm going to talk about. There are excesses in all three basic major asset classes: stocks, bonds, and real estate. I'll talk about those, and then talk about inflation in consumer prices, which is an emerging narrative. So I'm going to talk about those three asset classes. This is a plot using my, the blue line is not mine, it's the Standard & Poor's Composite Stock Price Index, which since the 1950s is called the standard S&P 500. In real terms, I've taken the inflation out of it. And I don't know if that strikes you, but this behavior of the index looks awfully strange right now. The green line is earnings per share that corresponds to this, partly backdated by Alfred Coles to 1871. And you can see that it's been choppy. It's not clear that we're not on an earlier trend. Why are the prices so high now? What's happening? I can't change the page. I'll leave it like this. It doesn't look quite as dramatic if you plot the blue line on the log scale. But even there, that's because it magnifies, so that the equal distances on the vertical axis represent equal percentage changes. But still, we're doing something quite dramatic here, since that's the so-called great financial crisis or great recession 10 years ago. This is Canada, just for comparison. They have the same behavior since 2009, but maybe less dramatic. I want to compare countries, and this is from the Barclays website. It's the CAPE ratio that I've been advocating for decades now, cyclically adjusted price-earnings ratio. And you can't see, there's too many countries here. You can see there's a wide dispersion across countries in how their stock markets are doing. The bottom performer here, you can see right there, is Turkey in terms of the CAPE ratio. And the second bottom is Russia. And then up here, the top performing country in terms of the CAPE ratio is the Netherlands. And the second highest is the United States. So why are these so different? The CAPE ratio looks historically very low in some countries and very high in others. I think we have to turn to stories or narratives about one reason the U.S. is so high is that it is strong in information technology, which is emphasized by the recent COVID-19 experience. But I don't have an answer yet, and I think we need more systematic work to try to understand these things. Just since you couldn't see Canada on the previous chart, I'll show it again. This is the CAPE ratio in red for Canada. Canada seems to kind of look similar to the U.S., except the level is quite different. The CAPE ratio is up at about 40 now in the U.S., and it's merely in the 20s in Canada. The second the second market is a bond market, and you can see this is a plot for the USA and Canada back to the 1950s. It's a remarkable pattern. They were both rising until around 1980, and they've both been declining ever since. It doesn't match up to the behavior of the stock market. Look how low it got. This was last summer. It got down to something like 0.5% on a 10-year bond. Incredible. You wonder, what are people thinking? Well, part of what they're thinking is that this is going to last, that there's a commitment from our central banks to do things like quantitative easing. This is a plot of the net asset purchases for 5 central banks. You can see both the Federal Reserve and the Bank of Canada. Well, you can see it clear. It's hard to see. That's up there, that little green at the top is the Bank of Canada. But they're doing it too. There is somehow a consensus around major economies about how to deal with the crisis. And it's quite different from history. So you might explain the stock market in terms of this policy. But the stock market hasn't been so sudden. It's not, quantitative easing was nothing like it is now until 2020. And the trend is going up for a long time. Here's the M1 money supply comparing the US and Canada. They both are, well, the US is more dramatic. But there's in fact, it's quite dramatic. You can see that people would think that something fundamental has changed. People who look at these data. But most people don't look at these data. We're talking about most people when we try to understand these market events. So I just... here's the consumer price index for the US and Canada. There's 2 lines that are separated because they're different base years. So for the US, the index equals 100 in the early 1980s. And for Canada, the base is around 2015. But they seem to be going up parallel. Nothing dramatic here, maybe. Well, it doesn't look dramatic when you plot it on a log scale, as I have. This is the great inflation. It was in both of our countries. So why did that happen? And why is it more stable now? I'm going to argue that we need to study the narratives. The third market I'm talking about is the housing market. And I like to create data that goes way back. There was no, for the US, this is for the US, this plot. There was no index of home prices that went back 100 years or more. So I spliced things together and I got an index which may not be perfectly accurate. But it's really remarkable what home prices have done. Between 1890 and 1990, there was almost no change. This is a repeat sale index, like a Case-Shiller index and then there was this huge run-up to 2005, and then it collapsed. And then another run-up again. Look, this is in real terms. What is going on here? It has nothing to do with building costs or population growth or even interest rates, unless you talk about the narrative that it generates. When interest rates get practically at zero, it creates talk of an opportunity, once-in-a-lifetime opportunity, I guess. But it's not something that looks like it would explain the behavior of home prices. I compare that with Canada. Canada is doing very well lately on its home prices. It looks different in this chart. This is nominal. I just took this off the Terranet website. But they are soaring, especially in major cities in Canada. And this plot shows the blue is the rate of change. The black line is the level of prices. So there are big changes in Canada as well. it's just amazing what's going on here. I made a plot. It's like the Teranet plot for the U.S. And they look kind of similar. But we were more dramatic in the U.S. in the price falls in the great financial crisis. And I'll move on. So the theory that I want to bring in here is a theory from epidemiology, from the School of Public Health here and there. And I'm going to start by describing here's my book here, Narrative Economics. I'm going to describe a model that was originally, I'm going to talk about a classic model from epidemiology that started in 1927 by Kermack and McKendrick. This has nothing to do with economics as they thought of it. This was a disease model, but it was used for forecasting diseases. So they have a contagion rate and a recovery rate in this theory. And if the contagion and recovery parameters are constant, epidemics are hump-shaped, often over a period of years. If the parameters change, and if there are discrete breaks in the parameters, then there can be second or third or more waves. It can be an annual wave, like an influenza, when the winter seems to encourage contagion more. So tends to be an upswing every fall and winter. Or it can be changes in the environment, which make the disease more contagious. So I'm going to argue that we can use the same model or the same models. There's like hundreds of variation of the Kermack-McKendrick model. And the Kermack-McKendrick model is widely used in terms of one of its variations in the world of epidemiology. In the United States, the Center for Disease Control gave a list of 50 forecasting models, and about half of them identified themselves as based on Kermack and McKendrick thinking. Here's the 1927 model taken straight from their journal article. S is the fraction of the population susceptible. I is the fraction of the population infected and therefore contagious. And R is the fraction of the population recovered and now immune. They left out deaths, which is important. You can easily modify it to put deaths in the model. Or they left out geographical changes, or these things spread geographically. So you can really, lots of things you can do with this model. But let's just stick with the basic model. And the key, it's a 3-equation differential equation model. Let's look at the middle equation. It's the change in the number of infectives. This is what you've been worried about of being part of this, DI/dt. It's a continuous time model here. And so the C is the contagion parameter and R is the recovery parameter. So the number infected is increased according to CSI because it requires a meeting of someone who is in S and a meeting of someone who's in I to produce a spread. So that's what they say. This represents the contagion here. And then they have minus RI because the infected are recovering and no longer contagious. And these other things make the 3 equations sum to 1. And that's the model. It's very simple, but it was a bombshell when it came in. So here is a simulation of that original Kermack-McKendrick model that I did some time ago. I used parameters for C and R that I thought were relevant maybe to the coronavirus without vaccine or without any public intervention. And what you can see, I had a simulation where it doesn't matter how many people, it's scalable, but let's say the initial 1 person is brought in, that's in 1 million people. carrying the disease, 0.0001%. And these are parameters which I picked, not very carefully. But you can see that for a long time the disease is growing, and it's not visible because it's growing exponentially, but from a very small thing. So that's the gestation period, and then suddenly it seems to break out, and you have a hump-shaped pattern for the number of infected. And you also, this is I that I've been talking about. It starts to go down eventually because there aren't enough susceptibles to catch the disease. This is the number of percent susceptible, that's S. And you can see it falls. And it doesn't fall to 0 because eventually the epidemic ends. It as this model prescribed. And the dashed line is the number who are recovered. So eventually, in this case, you get 80% of the population catches it. So where are we now? In the United States, it's 15%, I think, of the population about who've caught it. And that's because we've pushed the contagion rate down with vaccination. But there are other things like the Delta variant that have come in and so on. So we have the actual behavior of, this is for the world, of COVID-19. The coronavirus it has multiple waves reflecting changes in CNR. So I'm going to apply that to narratives. Now, one thing that epidemiologists tell is another variation on the HIV model, on the SIR model, that is that the diseases tend to occur together. For example, HIV and tuberculosis tend to occur together because they affect each other's contagion rates. So there are other things that I want to talk about is the polarization of society. People form a constellation of narratives that go together in their minds. And you can have a polarization of society where a certain constellation of narratives is in everyone's mind. So one example of is Donald Trump and Trumpism. This illustrates human behavior, especially now with modern electronic communication. To me, living in the United States, the all-encompassing power of the Trump narrative was it just amazed me. It was everywhere. So I was wondering how much it was in Canada. And I had the idea of searching on Google all for the phrase Canada's Donald Trump. And these are individual people who look like Donald Trump in the minds of Canadians, I guess, or other people. I got 81,400 hits. And it's not just anyone. You're probably thinking, who is Canada's Donald Trump? There are a number of people who are given that honor in Canada. So we're seeing polarization of attitudes to COP26, the conference in Scotland about global warming. You'll find people who say it's a hoax, other people who say it's a scourge of our time, and you don't get satisfaction in looking at these narratives. One thing is that you need to process a lot of information to understand the penetration of various narratives. And you also have to bear in mind that many people are deliberately and cynically manipulating narratives. I suggest you watch this YouTube show. George Mason, you probably haven't heard of him. He's 24 years old. He is an internet star. And on TikTok and YouTube, he gets millions of hits in the West. He's in the UK. And at one point, he decided to make a challenge for himself to get penetration in China. He doesn't know anything about China, but he got a translator to help him and put Chinese subtitles on his slides. And he just went at it. And he gave himself 1 week to become famous in China. And it's fun to watch him. He tries various manipulations. He was attentive to what Chinese people are interested in. He found that they like Harry Styles, who is a vocalist. So he said he admits openly with no hesitation to lie, to say that he lied about it and said he's Harry Styles' cousin, and he knows a huge increase in the power of in that narrative, and he ended up with almost 2 million views in 1 week. Well, 1 week of dropping 26 videos into the Douyin. So this is happening now. And it gets down to what is it that makes a narrative successful? It's experimentation, first of all. You don't know what will register. But it's on top of that just some sort of sensitivity to what's in the air, what's incipient, what's in the early stages of a hump-shaped pattern. So the third item on my agenda here is to talk about perennial popular narratives that are still alive today. These are the 9 narratives that I singled out in my book, which has a long history it takes a long historical perspective. The first narrative that I talk about is financial panic. That narrative grew throughout the 19th century in English language publications to a peak around 1907. The story seemed to be about a banking panic, not a stock market crash. It was about people rushing to the bank to get their money out before the bank failed. And the 1907 crisis was helped along by J.P. Morgan, who persuaded financiers in New York to buy into the declining markets. And he became a hero, a folk hero. It led to the foundation in the U.S. of the Federal Reserve System. So we're still, the institutional structure that we have is still historically based with one narrative, which has faded since then. A frugality narrative that you don't need to show off. It was responding to a book by Thorstein Veblen that coined the term conspicuous consumption. Also, keeping up with the Joneses was a popular phrase. You don't have to keep up with the Joneses. I think this contributed to the Great Depression. And maybe it wasn't so bad. People were nicer. It's been commented by people in the Great Depression. They weren't so show-offy as they were in the 20s. There were different stories about who's good. The gold standard peaked in 1896. You might say that's because 1896 was the year when the presidential election proposed dropping the gold standard with bimetallism. But I don't think so. I think the gold standard and bimetallism narrative began before 1896. And it was William Jennings Bryan, the presidential candidate, who took it on as a major campaign theme in 1896. That made it peak then. But it wasn't invented by William Jennings Bryan. No way. But we see something similar. People like stories about changing the money supply. Not quite sure why. It's a contagious story. It resurfaced with Bitcoin more recently. Labor-saving machines replaced many jobs. That was a peak. That was rising. It goes back to Aristotle, who talked about this thousands of years ago. But it got stronger during the Industrial Revolution. I think it peaked around 1919. It came back in 1936 during the Great Depression. It peaked again in 1930. These are waves. Automation was a different kind of labor-saving machine. It started to grow in the 1950s, and fears of automation peaked in 1964. It came back again. Automation has been with us, the recurring narrative. Artificial intelligence came in and peaked in 1987. That's even more dramatic than automation. Land bubble, that peaked in 1827. Well, there was a panic of 1837 that also relied on that. Peaked again in 1934. but now it's been replaced by housing bubble. They really should call it a land bubble because it's the value of the land that's scarce. You can always build a house. You can't change the land. Stock market crash, 1929. There were no stock market crashes, or almost none, before that. People weren't focused on the stock market. It became a legend then, and it's with us very much. Came back in 1987 in response to the one-day drop in the market in October. Boycotts, 1886. There was the word entered our land. A Mr. Boycott was the subject, was the object of a no-buy thing, and so his last name, to his great regret, is now famous, become a word. Profiteers became popular after World War I, when some people got rich off the war and other people were dying. Greedy business became popular in 1935. All these things have emotional connotation. It's not just an expectation, it's an emotional context. So the 1920 called post-war depression was also, you could call it the boycott recession, because that's what they thought they were doing, not spending money. The wage price spiral. Now this is what I'm going to get to next. It's the most recent of these, and maybe it's largely forgotten. I was just opened my newspaper yesterday, the New York Times, and there was a front page of the business section, introduction to the wage price spiral. And the author said, economists call it the wage price spiral. No, they don't. This wage price spiral story began long before economists were into it. It was out there, and then people jumped onto it. But what is the story? It's the wage price spiral story is the story of labor unions, greedy labor unions, pushing for their members and don't care about anybody else. We'll create these horrible strikes that are a big nuisance, and it'll profit us. Eventually, you'll be hit by it because the business side of it has to raise their money. It has to raise their prices and to get the money to pay the higher wages. So it repeats itself regularly. It's a feedback loop. Exciting idea. When did it come in? And buyers strike. That you'll stop buying because you're angry at these greedy companies and greedy labor unions. So I'm just not going to buy. The buyers strike. They didn't say wage price spiral yet, but the buyers strike was huge in the 1920s and very brief. And it came in again after World War II. And it's weak now. Do you know anyone who is not buying because there's too much inflation? It's weak. But I think it's poised to come back. Here's the Canadian-American economist, John Kenneth Galbraith. He wrote a best-selling book. It came out in 1958. And he says that he's acknowledging that people are talking about the wage price spiral. Few subjects are more debated than the relative responsibility of workers and employers for the price advances. In the inflation drama, the union is by common consent. It is the instigator of that familiar of economic phenomena, the wage price spiral. He's not claiming credit for it, but he's saying it's very important. I'll skip this. Other people were talking about a buyer's strike in the 1950s. In fact, it was common to think that everybody knew that the recession of 1957-58 is the result of a buyer's strike. So people were really angry. It was polarizing. There was a lot of hostility emerging for labor unions who were lazy and wanted to be paid more and more, always more, but it's coming out of our pockets. That's how the public saw it. Our President Eisenhower almost asked for a buyer's strike. In fact, if you look at his State of the Union address in January of 1957, he talks about it in those terms. and he's giving a moral implication to people not to spend too much. And he said, where is it in here? He said he doesn't want to ask for a buyer's strike, but he is asking for one. Well, here it is. This is in September of '57. This is the President of the United States saying, I'm not advocating a buyer's strike, but I do know that we should buy selectively and carefully to avoid inflation. So inflation was thought to be the number one, like in this cartoon, the number one problem. And it wasn't an emotionally neutral problem. It was about selfishness and greed, and it was going to destroy democracy and it's theft. It was very emotional. I did a survey asking people about what they think causes the general inflation on wages and salary. I did this in 1996, but I think we're talking about perennial narratives here. So what affects the if there's a price increase, a general inflation, what happens to wages? I gave the questionnaire both to individuals in the United States and economists. One is the price increase will create extra profits for my employer and have no effect on my pay. Two was competition among employers will cause my pay to be bid up. I could get outside offers. Three, a sense of fairness and proper behavior will cause my employer to raise my pay. They liked 3 and 1. Economists, look at that. Only 4% agreed with 1. So there's a big difference in the way economists think about inflation. The economists would talk about the wage lag, that the response to wages to prices is slow, but it eventually responds. The public seems to think that it'll never respond, that this is all going to the price inflation cycle is going to the labor unions. Do you agree with the following statement? When I see projections about how many times more a college education will cost, etc., I feel a sense of uneasiness. Makes me worry that my own income will not rise. Look at the difference between economists and the public. 66% of the public agreed with that. They really think it's destroying them. They think it's some evil people in the labor unions are killing them, making them poor. And this has to be stopped. They like the word greed, greed and inflation. So they didn't know what to do about it. They thought it was a moral problem. So under President Gerald Ford in 1974, he decided to launch a campaign asking people to not buy so much because it's causing inflation. They distributed buttons, win buttons. That stands for whip inflation now. It sounds like he's another president asking for a buyer's strike. But he says, no, don't waste food. You're cutting, I don't know, that will help solve the inflation problem. People really thought differently from economists. In 1982, there was talk in Canada under Pierre Trudeau of doing something like whip inflation now. This is from a New York Times article. And it says they were commissioning an emblem showing the numerals 5 and 6 against a maple leaf. So 5% this year inflation, 6% next year. And they hope to have this shown on products. It didn't, I don't think they did it. I couldn't find I searched Google Images at some length. I couldn't find it. But there was a term called jawboning, which was thought to be the solution to inflation. Jawboning is what President Bush and Eisenhower and Trudeau were thinking of doing. We lost that. That idea is faded. So we had changes in governments as a response, I think, partly to the change in narratives. Margaret Thatcher was a strike breaker. Ronald Reagan in 1980 came in as U.S. president, strike breaker. Brian Mulroney came in 1984, a strike breaker again. This was because people were fundamentally angry about a model of the economy, which I think came from outside of economics profession. Well, the term inflation just rose. Nobody even talked about they didn't have the word inflation in the 1900s. Those hits were not for inflation of the price level. They would sometimes speak about depreciation of the currency. Inflationary became a word for evil, I think. Now it's coming back. So the this is a search for inflation. It has been modest. This is from Google Trends. And both the USA and Canada are on the same wavelength here. I'm going to conclude with a discussion of the American dream, which strikes me as an important trend that it might be subject to change, but that has driven consumption. You can see how the term American dream has steadily went up. What is the American dream? Well, it was coined the term was coined in 1931 by James Truslow Adams in a best-selling book called The Epic of America. He defined the American dream as a dream of opportunity for all, for every man, each according to his ability or achievement, rather than social status or aristocracy. He said it is not a dream of motor cars and high wages, but a dream of a social order in which each man and each woman shall be able to attain the fullest stature of which they are innately capable and recognized by others for what they are. I think it's really interesting that he spelled it out here. Each man and each woman. Like nobody was doing that. He was ahead of his time. He wasn't uniform in doing it, but he did do it. But now it's, according to Nicholas Kristof, writing in the New York Times, it's now the Canadian dream. The American dream has just swapped citizenship, or is more likely to be found in Canada or Europe. That is the equal opportunity. But as a result, or as conspicuously a part of this, the American dream has morphed in its usage towards a dream of the pleasures of home ownership. And some people are starting to call it the North American dream because it's happening in Canada too. So I did a search, American dream, and compared it with Canadian dream. It's not the Canadian dream. It's something about our shared narrative across countries that is boosting markets in Canada at such a level right now, or it's part of what it is. It's partly the Bank of Canada with its asset purchases, but I don't want to blame the Bank of Canada for this. It's a narrative-driven thing as well. Here's a book on Canadian Dream by a Canadian author, and it sounds more like 1931, but that's 2002. If you were to come up with a new edition, maybe housing is the Canadian dream too. I wanted to talk about, I'm just going to conclude that we need, I think that it's coming. The availability of the data is going to make it come. And the data is becoming increasingly available. I think we should educate our graduate students in research methods that have been used by psychology, sociology, anthropology, history, marketing, journalism, and folklore studies. We need new methods to increase our understanding of changing patterns of narratives. Things that don't fit in so well in our current atmosphere. And I think, and the last point, we have to somehow come up with a map of the constellation of narratives, or a tree where they, like a biological tree of life, to various narratives. Because it's not one narrative, there's always polarization of some amount, and people in different circumstances will listen to different constellations of narratives. So I think that also we have to consider new technology. With the social media already changing the contagion rate fundamentally, we need new, we will be seeing new data availability, and we'll see new forms of economic theory. But I think we also want to do it better. We want to start collecting data better so we know what better where the ideas are coming from, who's sharing them. I think focus groups that are done on a regular basis would be a great idea. And I'll stop with that.
Well, thank you so much, Robert. That was a great presentation. We still have a few minutes left, and so if you're interested in asking a question, just put your hand up and I'll try to identify you. Then you can unmute and ask your question. So while we wait to see if there's other questions, let me pose you a question there. In terms of, like, as we see all this social media and all this kind of contagion, so who should be controlling, or should there be any controls on the kind of whole aspect of communication through social media? I'm sure it's something you've thought about, so let me throw it out as a question here.
It is something I've thought about, and I have to say the story scares me. We might be seeing the end of democracy. The ability to manipulate is stronger than before. We might see more polarization that is dangerous and anger-producing. We have systems now where websites will automatically suggest other people who think like you, without inquiring whether it's right or not. And how do we decentralize authority? How can we be democratic when we have such concentrations of power now? So I have a note of appreciation for political scientists who I think are working on this. It's a deep and important problem. I feel what I gave here is sort of a research proposal and not a final understanding.
No, I agree. There's this aspect of, like you said, this part of just kind of finding people like you. You'd think prior to, if you went, back in time when it was a bit harder, you'd have your kind of group around you. And if there's like 1 in 1,000 people that think a particular way, well, the chance that you actually had anyone that thought your way, if you're one of those thousands, it's very, very hard. Now with the social media, if you want to find people, even if it's only 1 in 1,000, it's pretty easy to find a whole group that'll think like you, and all of a sudden that kind of creates a whole other dynamic. So it's certainly a very important transmission there. I think I saw. Okay. Okay, so this question of seeing inflation. So there's a question here from a grad student at University of Ottawa in terms of this notion of greed, as you kind of said, and that kind of view of viewing inflation. And then the question is just asking if you've looked at whether that particular perception of how to view inflation has evolved over the 25 years, or you have a view of how it might be evolving more recently, if it still is that greed way of thinking about it, and is that the way you're thinking about that narrative around inflation?
Yeah, it's a complex story. In the United States, we saw a surge a few years ago of Bernie Sanders, who was a self-identified socialist. And that took me by surprise. I don't know. I think we're kind of at a low ebb for hostility to business. The level of the fascination with, well, first of all, we elected Donald Trump, who was a tough business person. And his success story fascinates a lot of people. I don't know how to summarize this. But I thought that the high levels of the stock market may reflect a decline in hostility toward business. We could do a lot more work on that.
So I see 2 more questions. I'll ask them to unmute. Jonathan, I see you have a question. Can you just unmute and want to ask Robert your question?
Sure. Thank you. And thanks for your keynote address, Robert. Your narrative examples have plenty of historical situations where it's politicians and not the central bank that's talking down inflation. But today we have a greater emphasis on central bank independence. So I was wondering how you think narrative economics should change the way central banks think about their communications, and what implications does it have for thinking about central bank independence in case narratives from politicians return?
Well, I thought it was interesting that Ben Bernanke became chair of the Federal Reserve in the United States, because he wrote a book, an interesting book about the Great Depression, and he knows about narratives, although he doesn't really focus on that in his public announcement. But I think the seriousness that he took, I'm just thinking of an American example. I think that the central bankers would do well. They know already they should be careful with their words, but because of the effect on markets. But maybe there could be more help offered them. What they say matters, not just in the short term, but in the long term. So if they say something that disturbs markets for one day, maybe that's not as bad as saying nothing. There has to be, there should be more help provided them in dealing with narrative economics.
So we're going a bit over. I'll take one last question. I see Cars, you have a question. Do you want to just unmute and kind of ask your question, Cars?
Yes, thank you, Professor Shiller, for your beautiful and inspiring lecture. You say narrative economics is a research program, so I was wondering, what would a model of macrofinance look like if you include narratives? How do you include narratives in macroeconomic modeling?
Well, I said at the beginning that Paul Beaudry's paper was an example on implicit contracts, recognizing that there is a